How you remember your trial, a way to mark every mile, a monument to a time.
Well, we kind of invite ourselves to come and to visit you here at work, and we're in 5 in Prestwich.
We're upstairs in 5, yeah, in the meeting room.
What's it all about? What's 5? What do you do?
We'll do anything that comes along. Sandwiches, kind of fresh food, that sort of trying to go for that niche market away from the greasy spoon, trying to have a front for events so that we can do different stuff, do stuff that people want rather than a sort of curled up sandwich and a sausage roll, and just see how catering goes, really.
So what gave you the push to having a go?
Being ill, I guess, realising that within a day, within an hour, things can change quite dramatically. So there's no point in prevaricating, really. You might as well just get on and do it and sort of not live for the moment, but go with the moment, really, with people that you enjoy being with. And far more people contact than I had in my previous job, which was a bit isolated, and sometimes there's too much time spent on my own, too much time spent in my head, really, rather than doing stuff. So I quite enjoy the physical nature of this, even though a lot of it's in front of a sink with pans, because Joel doesn't like washing up. But
so what was that previous life? What were you doing?
I was the executive director of it was a charity that advised government and delivered training on social, emotional and behaviour difficulties. So very varied, work on working parties, writing stuff, delivering training, organising conferences. So quite varied, but quite lonely in many ways. Lots of time spent travelling, lots of time spent with some really nice people, but increasingly with people that were kind of full of their own importance, and I didn't like that.
But it was a significant job, wasn't it? At times, I mean, you were doing things that were
they were
nationally quite significant.
Yeah, but they were kind of meaningless because being involved with government is just too whimsical. Things change according to whim. It just struck me. So what seemed to be important one day ceased to be important the week after because somebody had a thought at government level. So whatever you'd done, £80,000 worth of work we put in 2008 has now been archived and is no longer seen to be important, though it was significant at the time. So that was quite dispiriting, really.
So between sort of the government work and now the sort of catering and very different world.
Very different, yeah.
There was this illness period, wasn't there?
Yeah.
When did that happen?
It was November. Was diagnosed in November 2011. Yeah, 2010. 2010. And operated on New Year's Eve 2010. So
can you flip back to that moment? Because in a sense, life had just been going along. You'd been doing this work, speaking around the place, writing, filming stuff.
Yeah, it's difficult because at times it's difficult to talk about. It's difficult to because it generates that same sort of. It can generate that same sort of panic if you talk about it. And other times it's okay. So there's something unknown about that. I think it was probably about a month of maybe 6 weeks, slightly longer, of not knowing the outcome, and therefore if you don't know, you don't know what you're dealing with. And that was the most difficult time, and obviously imagining the worst. And then as obviously it isn't the worst prognosis, the sort of feeling, I understand the sort of survivor's guilt in a sense when you hear of other people that didn't, and you think, well, I wonder if they're going to discover more that I've got, or there's something that's quite odd about the difficult bit being behind you.
Because what we're talking about is cancer, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
That was the illness.
Yeah.
in this context, there's some words that really become quite difficult to talk about, don't they? So cancer can be difficult to talk about, and death actually can be quite difficult, because on the worst days you imagine the worst.
Yeah, it was difficult to actually say the word, and it was difficult. I remember before I was diagnosed, and before when I was concerned, and before anybody knew about it, I guess, Jack Duckworth on Coronation Street had, I think he had a brain tumour or something, and I used to watch Coronation Street fairly religiously, and I couldn't watch it, and there's certain programmes that flagged up cancer in the I think it might be Channel 4 or something, and I just couldn't watch them. I started watching sort of programmes like QI all the time, in case any of the characters, in case you had to sort of face it. It's a strange word it became a strange word to use, something strange to acknowledge, and I don't think that's unusual. One of the few nurses that actually spoke in the hospital, spoke any sense or actually did much, said it's nobody goes away from it without some sort of life change. It turns your life on its head, whatever the outcome of it, really, just because you face that possibility.
You've been a Christian for maybe 20 years at that point, haven't you?
Surely not. Yeah, probably 20, 21, 22.
Yeah. So how did you find things like prayer? Did you find prayer hard? And
no, not really. I there was a lot. What was very humbling is that there were a lot of people praying for me and on my behalf, both within the church and within the context of the job that I was doing. And it was easy for me to ask. Strangely for me particularly, easy to ask people I didn't know if they would pray for me. It's harder to ask people that you do know, but there were people within SEBDA that were sort of committed Christians, and I could just say, well, will you pray for me, and will you pray that it's not gone anywhere else? Because, when I was diagnosed, we knew where it was, and we knew it was operable where it was, but we didn't know what stage it was at or anything like that. So I didn't find that bit difficult at all, strange as it may seem, particularly for me. Yeah.
In the middle of it, what were you conscious of God? Were you conscious of the presence that?
Not at the time, but on reflection, it was much easier than I thought it'd be. The anticipation was worse, and I suffer from high blood pressure, and it was going through the roof. And that was a concern, because if they said the blood pressure was going up, then they weren't going to operate. And I thought it became that every day became significant, because every day you thought, well, this could be the day that, if they're saying it's okay and it's in one place, this might be the day that it spreads, and you can't afford not to have the operation then. And of course it was due to have it on the 28th of December, and the surgeon the consultant was ill. So I went to the hospital full of anticipation, and she phoned up and said, I can't do it. So there was another 3-day wait, I think, and I'm thinking, well, in those 3 days that was the constant worry, that okay, we can deal with it where it is, and I know what's going to happen, and I just want the cancer out, but what do we do if it's spread? And until, I suppose, the operation, that was always the thing that was on my mind. But the operation itself was quite remarkable in that the sort of levels of pain were managed really, really well. I thought it would be much more difficult.
That's kind of like, where is that? That's about 18 months ago, isn't it now? Just about 18 months.
I've just had my 18-month check. Yeah.
Okay, and things are okay?
Yeah, things are fine. I go back every 3 months, and it's fairly anxious the sort of last couple of hours before you go in. But yeah, that's quite sobering to know that you sort of, nobody's going to say you're better till 2020. That's just just keeps.
Yeah.
It's there at the back of your mind, and almost daily, is everything okay? But
when that nurse said that, everybody who goes through this, it becomes life changing at some stage or other. Are the things that you think? Did you learn anything about yourself in the midst of that? Were the things that you've come away with
Do you want a long list of things I learnt about me? Yeah, I learnt lots about myself. I learnt lots about other people as well. I realised how fortunate I was and how privileged I was to be surrounded by the people that I am, and that's really significant. You know, it wasn't just a struggle for me; it was a struggle for a lot of people. So I felt thoroughly and utterly cared for and supported. I couldn't have asked for any more, and that's sort of carried on, and that is really, really humbling. So yeah.
And what about your faith? What happened to that?
Obviously, it was a test of faith. It was an effort. I can say that it strengthened my own faith, but it's a difficult one. It's always a difficult question for me to assess. More and more convinced it's about how you conduct yourself, and it's what you do rather than what you say. Mm-hmm. And that was hence this place. You know, don't just talk about it. Get on and do something.
Did you think, actually, I'm going to make the move now, I'm going to make the change?
When I went back, I just wasn't happy doing it, and we'd also got a change of government and new stuff to do, and it just seemed a bit treadmillish, really. I don't know how I got from April to I went back until October when we got this. I don't know how it happened, but it just... It seemed to be a conversation I had with Joel about how do you fancy opening a shop, and him saying yes, and I'm thinking no, he's bound to say no. Why would he want to work with an old fogey? Why would he say yes? And why are we doing it? And then he said, are we going to look at some shops? And I thought, yeah, okay, then we'll go and look at some shops. And it just happened very, very quickly, because ideally you wouldn't have opened a food outlet on a main road in Prestwich where there's no parking. But we did, because it just seemed to be... Things seemed to fall into place. Call that God, it just wouldn't... We looked at other places and thought, no, there are too many problems here. There are just as many here, but here is where we ended up, sort of 2 minutes from home. In a community that is just starting to become a community again, with lots going on with local businesses, and with a view that my savings will set us up. I'll be able to dip into what I used to do. So I still do some teaching, I still do some consultancy. I'm still supposed to do some writing, though it's not something I particularly want to continue with. So that pays us the rent. I don't want to do it for that much longer. But if it doesn't work, all we've lost is money. We've given it a go, and I guess that's where we're at. So we're just trying different things.
In one sense, that's quite a liberating thought. The only thing you've lost is money.
Yeah, it really, really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. You know, I used to change my car quite regularly. I'm not really into cars, but I'd liked renewing it, and I tended to look after it, and I don't do that anymore. The car I've got is fairly bashed. It's not important. It is only money.
Do you think, here you are as a follower of Jesus, with a shop? How do you see God using you here now? Because in one sense, when you were working on the grand scale, it would be quite easy. I would look at that and say, well, I could quite easily see how God might have, placed you and used you. And yet here on a very local scale, how do you get a sense of that? In fact, is it more so?
Yeah, probably more so, because, as I said, that was quite fickle and whimsical, and I think that it might have been significant in minor ways. But here, you've got people and you've got a community, and we've got a regular group of people, and we've got 2 doors down someone that's opened up, taken what we're doing and tried to replicate it 2 doors down, and people watching us to see what we're going to do about it, to see if we're going to get involved in a price war or outmarket him, and are quite intrigued by the fact that we're saying, yeah, we're annoyed by it, but no, we're not going to reduce our prices to make us more competitive with him. And that's quite a strange... There's God in that somewhere, because they're expecting us to... All of our neighbours, and they're all very loyal, and they've come in and said, oh, you need to put... he's got this, you need to. Why don't you? Sort of suggesting quite cutthroat...
Yeah.
things, and no, let him do what he's got to do. Interestingly, Joel far more so than I get irate from time to time, but we're not doing anything about it, and that's quite interesting as part of a bigger business group that we're now involved with.
I see you with some of the people who come at the odd times, and you've been very hospitable.
Prestwich is full of quite needy people, and
yeah.
We get them in and we have a chat, and they become regulars in just the same way that, a clientele that wants pastrami and brie and, to create a sandwich that is quite cutting edge as far as they're concerned. We have tea and toast and bacon butties and sort of chat to people. So, yeah.
In quite a grounded way.
Yeah, I just think it's far more significant than writing something that 10% of the population might know about and 0.10% might read. It's just, it's much more me and much more earthy, I think. Than...
When you look ahead, what do you see? What are your hopes? What are your hopes for your business? What are your hopes on a personal level?
I think one of the things I've learned is not to look ahead, because you can't. That just kind of leads to regret. I don't look ahead a lot. I mean, obviously in business terms, but the reason 5 is 5 is because 5 is fairly significant in terms of 5 adults, and the privilege of being with the 5 children and hopefully 5 more others, that it's become a centre for them, which is really gratifying. It's something that they gather around. So I think what I'd want for the future is just to be part of their lives, really, and just to, I think probably simply that, not...
Do you think you fear less than you might have done at one time?
Yeah. I have no fear of the future, because there's... I don't know what I would lose. I don't know what I'd lose doing this, and I think... Prior to the illness, I think that the fear was losing face, not doing a good enough job. There was this somebody that was going to come along and say, well, that's a really good job that you've done, and realising that's mythical. When I was doing the sort of the writing and the research, obviously you're aware that one of the passions was to do with what well-being is, and obviously a spiritual element of that. Well, one thing I have learned in reality, that well-being is about your own efficacy, really. It's not, you can't wait for other people to come along and say, as nice as it is, that's really good, you've done that really well. I've lost that striving for that and realised that it's got to come from me. It's not going to come from anybody else. And if I know that I've worked hard and I've given this a good go, then that's all that really is important. It might not succeed. It might be because of the guy 2 doors down. It might be because of the recession, and in a sense that doesn't matter. If you've given it a go and you've done it as well as you could do at the time and in the circumstances, then I think that's probably enough, and that's quite a radical shift in thinking.
This is all part of a series of that we've called Stories as Stones, this idea of the story that people live in and live through, and the fact that every now and again in the Bible narrative there was a moment where people would set up a stone, or they'd certainly name a place, and they find a name, or they find a way of explaining something that they'd learnt along the way. If you were doing that, if you were going to set up your stone at the moment, what characteristic of life or God or being a Christian would you say, I want to name it that?
Okay, it would be that the very, very, it sounds very cliche, but the best thing that you can give someone is time.
How you remember your trial, a way to mark every mile, a monument to a time, an uphill struggle you climb, share it with stories.
Life can be very confusing when you're living it going forwards. It kind of makes sense sometimes when you're able to look back, but at the time when you're living it, it can be a mixture of scary, encouraging, enjoyable, and just downright frightening. This series has been Stories and Stones, and we wanted to get the idea that wherever they were in Israel, there were places being named after memories of what they'd experienced of their life in the land. And then every now and again, they'd build these monuments, these very basic Spartan stones would be raised. And they'd say, at this spot, we want you to remember something significant. In the earlier part of the Old Testament, you hear a lot about the Philistines. All the children will know about David and Goliath, one of the Philistines. But even before that story, even before David comes along, the Philistines had been a problem. And when Samuel was one of the judges, there's a moment when he brings the people of Israel to a place and he erects a stone. And he names this stone Ebenezer. And Ebenezer is a name that means stone of help. And as they constructed that, Samuel said, thus far as the Lord helped us. And the Philistines were subdued, and they didn't invade Israelite territory again. A stone in the middle of perhaps nowhere that just was a reminder that this far we've come, and God's been our help. And the future, who knows about the future? It lies ahead of us, and we know for them the Philistines would come again. There would be more battles to face. But at this point, we're confident that God has been with us. It's interesting listening to Barb's story about the different changes that have happened, the change of direction, the change of significance, the change of purpose. Thus far as the Lord helped us. The future, who knows about the future? It's difficult to imagine what it will look like. But we walk forward in faith, saying, at least this far, we're confident that God's been with us.